This is CC Confidential, a selection of bonus clips from our podcast recording. Welcome to our segment with Dryden Brown, CEO of Blue Book Cities. Fun fact, Dryden was a pro surfer as a teen. He tells us which book inspired him to start thinking about changing the world. We also talk about the importance of getting incentive structures right, charter cities as a soft power weapon, and the article he wrote after meeting a talented young kid on a flight to Ghana.
I spent a lot of time traveling for surfing, going to surf contests and so forth when I was in high school. I read a lot of sort of libertarian literature, as one does. My dad was into these ideas too. So I actually read George Gilder's Knowledge and Power, and he talks about charter cities. He talks about Paul Romer and how he introduced this idea. And there's this sort of iconic image of these young students doing their in Africa, doing their homework under a street light. They have this very modern technology, but they don't have this quite old technology of having electricity in their home. And the idea is that, you can set up these special legal zones where you don't have regulatory capture that ends up increasing the price of electricity or something for these students such that they can't afford. I thought that was kind of interesting. I was like, setting up new cities sounds fairly interesting.
And you were thinking this while you were going to surfing competitions, you were reading libertarian books and...
These are just sort of like naive, 15-year-old thoughts where, you think you see these obvious optimizations in the world. You think, I'm so bright and thank God I found this book that no one else has read. And, we could sort of change the world in this really positive way quite easily. That's never really the case. It can be quite useful to write literature that conveys problems as being much sort of simpler to solve than they actually are. You have to engage in this sort of naivete to even get started working on these problems, right? And then you get to the more serious literature that helps you understand, all right, what are the sort of nuanced problems and so forth. The insight with Blue Book Cities is we want to build a political model with better incentive structures, and it's hard to reform existing models. So we want to sort of go out onto the margins and find a politically viable way to build a private city, a city that's oriented towards producing sort of satisfaction in its customers, as opposed to these myriad political concerns that sort of the metropole in the West tends to be concerned with.
Dryden, I have a question. When you build a charter city in a new country, in Africa or whatever, isn't power really with the local government? They could pull the rug out from under you at any time?
I think there are these interesting political structures that you can employ. The more that cities are oriented towards free cash flow, the more they're going to be oriented towards serving customers' needs. And if your sort of customer base is this, highly verticalized intellectual circle, you're probably going to be able to stay true to that. The sort of local government, the private government that's implemented by the company and then sort of later integrated into the institutional fabric of the host country. If you can structure the incentives right, then I think it can persist in a way that maintains the values of the city. But there are these much more challenging questions of how do you actually make this happen in the first place? How do you solve the political problem? And I think one way to think about this, I think charter cities can be viewed as a soft power weapons technology. What I mean by that is, the State Department has these various organizations what used to be OPIC, now the U.S. IDFC, DFC, sort of invest money in these various infrastructure projects in a way that's somewhat competitive with China, right? China is trying to set up this system where they have all these tributary states that ship them metals and whatever, and these Chinese governments don't have access to infrastructure finance that's at as competitive rates as they're being offered by the Chinese. They end up selling half of their country and all their bauxite to some Chinese government or sort of de facto government and corporation. The State Department wants to have competitive offerings for infrastructure finance. They can't do it off their own balance sheet. So one way to view charter cities is, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to go out and set up new culture that helps, the country view America more favorably, that sort of is able to attract the human capital required to develop a local financial center and eventually give that country access to global liquidity, right? With global liquidity, I mean, you can finance these infrastructure projects at rates that are more competitive with China, and there just isn't enough money sort of on the State Department's balance sheet to finance these projects. But there is, and just Western capital markets that now can't really go into these they're hesitant to do deals, do big deals.
Dryden, so I think Jess's point was, I think we can agree that obviously there's a Cold War going on, right? So you're talking about soft power weapons technology, and that all makes sense. But I think Jess's point was also referring to the fact, I think we've spoken about it a bit, of people say that, for example, the dollar's value is backed because of the military, right? So it's because of that there's actually value to it. We have all this naval power, right? We can go and force the dollar's value anywhere in the world if we want to. But the problem, I think, Jess, maybe you can correct me here, is that like, so say you build a city in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and it's all going fine and dandy. One day they come in with guns. How do you plan in the event and the insurance of a hot war? So like, is that private military? Is that Blackwater? How are you thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we don't want to have. I mean, our plan is not to bring a bunch of Blackwater people over, not to
Let's hope.
not to like militarize our. I mean, certainly we'll have police and private security to make sure that our residents are safe. But I guess what I was trying to express earlier is that charter cities are a political tool for global hegemonic powers, right? So for the US, a charter city is a tool to develop a stronger relationship with Ghana or Nigeria or whatever. And then sort of for Ghana, establishing these links with the United States is beneficial for a number of reasons. Again, one of which is like better access to capital markets. I mean, what you want to do is just get the incentive design problem right at the outset so that the project is super beneficial to the Ghanaian government, it's super beneficial to Ghanaians, and it's super beneficial to the United States government, right? Sort of if you can structure all that correctly at the outset, then sort of you shouldn't have any like real conflicts. Like if you get to a point where like the police are being sent, it's already too late.
I'm just curious about the perception from like the local point of view.
Right. It could be like neo-colonialist, right? Like the whole,
certainly,
white Americans going in. It sounds, almost like a repeat of the 1870s.
Right. So this is one of the common criticisms. Usually it's just sort of a weapon of the opposition party. It's like there's some political points that some group can score by sort of framing this thing in a really negative light, even if it's super beneficial to the local population. I think this is certainly a big issue for these countries that I think probably less of these projects will end up being done there because you're just constraining the sort of like founder market when you're just sort of not like wanting Americans to go over and do these projects there. Then it's like, okay, like we've built our whole like distribution in America, like silky, like in the Valley, people know about charter cities. They sort of know about these ideas. In Ghana, not that many people have heard about these ideas yet, right? So there just aren't that many like Ghanaian founders that are trying to do this sort of thing.
Ani had mentioned that you wrote the article about finding the lost Elons, and I ended up reading it.
The article was about sort of meeting this kid on a flight to Ghana who was working on building a bus factory in Ghana, and basically describing the sort of regulatory constraints that made it challenging for him to get financing to pursue this project that he wouldn't have faced in the U.S. So, for example, in Ghana, there's a minimum foreign investment law. So I think the minimum investment's like $300,000 or $500,000 or something like that. It's quite hard for a young Ghanaian entrepreneur to raise a small pre-seed round, a small seed round, especially when they have no background. Right? It's like even if they could connect with some VC on Twitter and that VC wanted to write them a $100K check, like the laws of Ghana would prohibit the Ghanaian, taking a check from a non-Ghanaian. Yeah, I mean, I guess I was trying to sort of demonstrate this point that often there are laws that inhibit like startup communities in these places, and if you sort of like just flip a very simple switch there, you can discover more of these people. You get more $50,000 checks written, $20,000 checks written, and so forth. So Patry backed Blue Book. He's doing awesome stuff. Patry is very focused on finding super high quality founders to just go try things in the space, develop the space. It's not a space yet. There aren't sort of sound ideas as to how new cities should be built, particularly. I think his strategy of just like, hey, we're a seed fund, pre-seed fund. Let's just find super, super talented founders and let them figure out sort of how to solve these problems. I think that's sort of the correct approach insofar as sort of accelerating the progress of new cities being built.
It's kind of just the Wild West. You guys are just let loose into the world to find like the next plot of land for a charter city.
There are a bunch of people that are sort of pursuing this. Mark Letter, he runs the Charter Cities Institute. So he's working with a few people who are working on these sorts of projects. They may work. Mark's a smart guy. We'll see if that strategy works. Geography is super important. This doesn't just work anywhere. It works in very specific circumstances. So I think, in Dubai, they built this massive port.
In your Lost Elon article, you had the picture side by side of the 11 years of development in Dubai. Pretty crazy.
In Singapore, they obviously had favorable geography and so forth. So in some circumstances, this model can work, building specialized infrastructure and attracting tenants that want to sell into the market and whatever, right? I mean, I guess my point about sort of Dubai and Shenzhen and Hong Kong and these cities that people on Twitter who like to talk about charter cities and whatever tend to sort of like put up as examples. I guess I would just want to put some context around the claim that you can just sort of implement good governance and then you'll just have a Singapore or a Hong Kong or a Shenzhen. Like that's not the case. Like it's a lot more complex than that. In the case of Singapore, it's just sort of massively privileged geographically. In the case of Shenzhen, right, it's like you have China, there's no real estate market. There's no sort of like, China wasn't really like interfacing with the West at that time. And they sort of opened up in 1980, they opened up Shenzhen, which was this little fishing village to the West, sort of experimented with this zone. And, they had a real estate market and so forth. So a ton of money flooded into Shenzhen to get exposure to China, exposure to the market and whatever. And it grew an insane amount. Talking to Alain Berthaud, urban planner at NYU, he was at the World Bank and he had the Chinese come and ask, hey, they had this plan and they needed like $1 billion to build out all this infrastructure for 10x population growth or something like that. And he was like, that's crazy. There's no way that the population is going to grow this much. Like we can't sign off on this plan. We can't finance this project. It ended up growing, I think, significantly more than they even projected.
China is a great example of this because they had the push toward the cities, right? So they pushed all the peasants into Shanghai, Beijing as one mode to increase GDP per capita, but also, just to get that cultural flourishing.